provide good documentation for the APIs that developers can use, and of course having comprehensive and rich set of documentation plays a significant part in the successfulness of a portal. You need to support developer onboarding, so things like self-provisioning, anything that would accelerate their use to consume the API or their ability to expose it as a producer are all helpful. Some type of a community support mechanism, a forum, or a way to get feedback is critical as well. And the portal generally is the place that you can facilitate that. And again, you're going to be able to provide a lot of API analytics and monitoring for your customers, both on the consumer side and the producer side. And lastly, additional developer resources like software development kits. At Kroger, we developed a linter that would help producers of APIs make sure that their API was following our API style guide. So things like that kind of expedite the developer process and developer lifecycle. So I think we want to start off with introductions. So you guys are going to have to share that mic there. And James, why don't you start off, introduce yourself, tell us a little about yourself.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I'm James Nose. I'm a product manager at Kroger, specifically over our developer marketplace as well as our API enablement team. I think we'll get into a little bit about what we do there, but personally, I'm very passionate about this space. Myself and my engineering cohort over there, Michael, we get very excited about the work we do. There we go. And yeah, so I just really, at the end of the day, my passion is around just creating a good developer experience, just like we would with any other products.
I'm Mackenzie Harper. I lead several teams of engineers here at Paycor in our platform space. That includes everything from security to implementation to our integration space, and it definitely also bring a lot of passion to making things accessible in our ecosystem, trying to make things so that our clients and partners have a lot of good access to that. So excited to be talking here today and kind of dive into what that means for our developer portal. Also, my boss is here, so if you have anything nice to say, you can tell him that as well.
Robert Buchanan here, currently at P&G building an API marketplace. So we have a developer portal, a developer marketplace, and API marketplace. All kind of different names, same thing. But this area in the space is one of those that I talk with Ken Lane a lot, who works at Bloomberg, formerly Postman, and we really decided that within this space, there's lots of ways to solve the problems. And it's really about bringing developers together to figure out the best way to approach the problems that they're trying to solve while encouraging them to build at a speed that hits the market at the right time. So enabling developers is really the biggest focus, and to do that, you need APIs, and that's how we're hitting the market today.
Make sure you hold the mic really close. All right, well, thank you for that. Now, without further ado, we'll just go ahead and move to our first question. So, there are a lot of API providers out there, and of course, they like to provide a complete solution and give you the developer portal and everything out of the box. Why would you create your own API portal in the marketplace? We'll start with James.
Great, because I was dying to talk about this one. Yeah. So, yeah, the interesting thing that I've found about trying to decide, hey, do we use a portal, like an off-the-shelf portal, or do we build our own? And I don't know if it's just within the industry, but one of the biggest problems I've seen is like they're typically the dev portal comes packaged with some other product, right? And to John's point, they're trying to kind of create a whole solution for you. But a lot of times those don't play well with each other, right? So when you think about Azure, right, they say, oh, well, we've got this dev portal, so everything in Azure, you'll be visible to you in the dev portal. But then you're like, well, what about GCP, right? And vice versa. There's a lot of instances like that. So, and I was just talking with some folks the other day about this, and it's not something that a lot of people haven't noticed that there's large gaps there. And the other thing too is there are a few places that are trying to create that kind of off-the-shelf dev portal that's plug and play, but they experience some headwinds with the companies that don't want them to do that because it takes away from, again, them being able to sell this complete solution. So kind of seems like to me there's a little bit of a war in the API industry, but and that's why a lot of people end up creating their own dev portals.
So I'm going to go out on a limb, James, and say that Kroger decided to build their own portal versus take one off the shelf.
Oh yes, we have to.
That's an insider knowledge on that.
To add to that, there's actually a movement within the bring your own API gateway in the industry to where a lot of the API management solutions are no longer a gateway and the dev portal and the identity provider. And there's movement with like Zuplo and Kong and a few others to really disrupt that space to start taking away those pieces. And a lot of people in the industry really talk about API portals and really go into the fact that every company has different needs. Authentication, authorization, the process lifecycle for getting access, who they're going to give access to, all that is not off the shelf. It's all custom. And the moment you buy it off the shelf and then try to customize it, you're in a world of pain. So
Robert, and then at P&G, then you are building your own as well.
Yep, P&G, we've built our own from the ground up, and we're taking a lot of things that I've learned in my past employers, formerly Kroger, and really taking what the industry is kind of moving towards and really incorporating it into the developer lifecycle. It's all API first, eating our own cookie.
Yeah, and I'll say for Paycor, we also built our own. We explored some others. We use Azure to control our APIM gateway, but what we get is control, right? We get to control what it looks like, the aesthetics, the user experience, and also cost. I think is a big one. When we have 30,000 clients, we want them all to use it. We don't want that to be a factor for how traffic might flow through there. So lots of different reasons, but for us, we found that there are a lot of other open source tools that you can use to bring into your developer portal, so you can kind of get the best of both worlds. You build it, you control it, and you get some of the standards.
So you guys talked a lot about the pros of building your own portal. Can you tell us about some of the challenges? And let's just go in reverse order, and you can start.
Yeah, I think some of the big challenges, depending on your security model, is you have to build everything from scratch. You have to consider everything from how is someone selecting what access, how are they going to go through like an authorization flow. There are a lot of things that I think become a little bit of a gotcha that after you figure those out, it's a little more smooth sailing. But I honestly would still accept that over being stuck in, I think, the box that maybe a vendor might put me in.
Yeah, and to add to the vendor part is, I think building your own gives you all the flexibility in the world. The downfall is combating the folks who are like, why didn't we just buy X? That honestly takes more of my time, combating the people that say, go buy X, or why didn't we buy Y, instead of just building the better software. From the developer standpoint, developers want to interact with APIs and consume it. They don't really care how they're consuming it, as long as it's a good experience. And what Mackenzie said was, we get to control that. So if our developers are further along the journey and we can shortcut a lot of the other things, we can do it. And we can also wheel it back and make it as easy as pie to go through our portal.
Okay, that's awesome. One last follow-up on this one. One of the other advantages I think we've seen in building our own portal was, right now it's for developers, for the developer experience, and specifically for APIs. But developers need more support than that when they're developing, especially within a larger company. They need a lot of different development resources. And at least at Kroger, we see the developer marketplace being kind of a landing zone for a lot of those other types of developer support that we can provide. So that's one that I love and hate at the same time. It makes a lot of sense from a developer experience, but given we still have a lot of things to do to support the API portal aspect of it, I don't want us to lose sight of that. And that's another challenge I think that you have to balance if you're going down that route. All right, let's switch gears slightly and talk a little bit about who's your target audience for your developer portal? Who are you trying to support with this project? Let's go with McKinsey.
Yeah, so for our public developer portal, it's all of our clients and any of the partners that we interop with. So we have 2.5 to 3 million employees on our platform. Not that we have them employed here, but 30,000 clients that are hiring, terminating, paying employees, and they need to be able to access that data. Think about all of the things that your company probably does with 401k providers. Your general ledger goes somewhere. You have a data warehouse you want to keep in sync with things that are happening here for your business. And so we wanted to make sure that our data was really accessible and that you didn't need to get on a phone with us in order to come access it, right? Data is really valuable, and so we wanted to open that door to our clients and for all of our partners that we're working with. So anytime they're building an integration with us, they're using our developer portal, and anytime that we are the ones building that integration with them, we are using our developer portal. So, mentioned earlier that you've got to use your own tools. We strive to do that too, because if we can't use it, they can't use it. And so that's really our broad audience is kind of everyone in that mix.
Yeah, we kind of break ours down a little bit. I mean, we have the same audience, so we have external developers, internal developers, and then we try to break that down a little bit further to think about it as API providers and API consumers. So we have internal consumers, external consumers, and internal providers. And we try to think about it that way just to separate the concerns of like how they may experience it, although a lot of times the provider is also a consumer. So, those definitely mix quite often, but yeah, like I said, we just try to break it down to those personas and try to look at the ways that we can impact them all and try to find features that are gonna have the most benefit for both. That's kind of how we at least start prioritization based on those personas.
Yeah, and for our portal, we're launching very soon, and our initial focus is going to be our developers internally. Our long-term focus on our portal is going to be architects, product managers. It's going to be above and beyond everyone to come to it, because your next API consumer could be a product manager who gets an idea and goes, hey, can we make this work? And really get it into the fact of everyone can access the data. They may not be able to build the application or code it, but they can at least see what's available and start connecting the dots.
Okay, thanks. And I think in that I heard a distinction between internal and external customers. How do you view them as the same versus different? Like, are those personas exactly the same? Are they different? Do you want to think of them as the same? Do you want to think of them differently? Tease that out a little bit. Sorry.
So yeah, because I definitely brought that up, and the reason why we make a distinction between internal and external is actually because, and this kind of goes back to the earlier one about the downfalls, and it's because we have role-based access that we manage in our system, which, speaking of downfalls of building your own, that's, I won't talk about it, but yeah, so, making sure we think of that perspective, because certain external consumers can't see certain things that internal can, and so like, we've got this concept of product pages, but if you're an internal consumer, you can see everything on there. If you're an external consumer, you may still have access to that API, but then there's still parts of that we still don't want you to see. So it's really helpful to think of it from that perspective, just again, because we have role-based access built into our system.
Yeah, I think for us, our strategy really keeps internal and external quite separate. Our product development and things that we're selling to our clients all goes through its own API ecosystem, but for that public edge that we have, any integrations, data in and out, are coming through our developer portal, and so that really becomes our key audience instead of anyone else internally.
So I'm hearing that McKinsey's coming across loud and clear. I need to talk louder, James needs to talk louder, and Robert needs to talk louder, or hold the microphone closer to it.
Awesome. Kind of what Mackenzie and James said is, I think the users, I like to think that the system itself should be treated the same. Internal, external, use the same system. Don't build two systems. Don't manage the data in different places. Now, what data they get access to, that just goes into your authorizations. What are you allowed to share? What are you not allowed to share? I really like to think of everyone as the same with internal and external, because your internal developer one day may be an external developer. They may leave the company, come back, and really want to leverage the outside APIs. Realistically, they're still developers, they're still architects, they're still product managers. So if you treat them all the same, you eventually get a system that's more symbiotic, in my view.
Yeah, now Robert, I remember having lengthy conversations with you on this topic, and one of the things we considered was trying to move toward a zero trust mentality as well. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that as well?
Yeah, so a lot of the security roles, like James was mentioning, RBAC is a pain in these types of ecosystems, and I think with a lot of the, when Google released the white paper on Google Zanzibar, their whole infrastructure of how they manage permissions in the cloud, I think it really changed the landscape and made it a lot easier to do these types of ecosystems, because now you can get very granular permissions on different entities for different organizations, or if you come in with an @pg.com versus an Kroger.com into the portal, you can automatically segment them into what they have access to based on the relationship to the different providers, different domains. And I think really the advancements in authorizations through things like Zanzibar really allow us to take advantage of this one system for all. And I think hopefully that trend keeps going, and we get out of the, we have an internal version and an external version, and now you have segmented data all over the place.
And one could argue that might even lead to a less secure situation when you're duplicating. I don't know that to be true, I just thought I'd throw that in there. So kind of related to that, but slightly different, we talked about internal, external users. How do you separate concerns between private, partner, and public APIs? James, why don't you start?
Yep. So again, that was one of the big reasons, aside from listening to Robert, who at the time convinced me it was a good idea to build RBAC into our application. That was one of the main reasons. That's kind of how we go about it. If you're part of the right organizations, you'll see different things. If you're not, you won't. And we recently, and in fact just recently, we released, before all of the public APIs and partner APIs that we had, we actually just put those in a separate specification and deployed those, and anyone could view them. And so one of the features that we actually just did was moving all of those APIs behind role-based access. So now those are driven behind permissions as well. And I think that's really given us an advantage, because now we're to a point where we can also start to share, like before you just saw public and private, or the public and partner where you didn't. Now we're to a point where we can actually start sharing partner APIs with specific organizations and third parties without having to expose those to everyone, right? So yeah, that's been pretty much how we different.
Yeah, I mean, for us, when I say we keep public and private separate, we really do, in that we have two separate gateways. One handles all of our public traffic, the other handles all of our internal traffic. Our public API is actually a full abstraction layer. So we pass all traffic through that. That's where all of our pretty documentation and shaping of objects happens. That then, as an abstraction, comes back to our private layer. So we have different concerns, right? The public layer, we want to be really nice. We want to add rate limiting and other things that help keep it secure. We don't have those concerns internally as much. I mean, we always have to be watching out for bad actors, but I'm less concerned about two products talking to each other as opposed to someone coming from the outside.
Yeah, and ultimately in the end, with your gateway deployment system, with your documentation, it really comes down to is what risk is there and assessing that risk appropriately. I mean, having one gateway or having many gateways doesn't change your risk profile. If your authorization is weak, if your identity is weak, it really doesn't change the game. Now, if you have strong suits in gateways, identity, and authorizations, you have a better secure front. Ultimately, with anything in security, is defense in depth, and make sure you cover your exploits and your holes.
So I'm hearing there's definitely pros and cons between having one system for both internal and external, and there's you can run into different sets of concerns if you separate them out. Interesting choices there. So digging into that a little bit deeper, we talked a little bit about the pros and cons from a security perspective. But how would potentially the life cycle of an API change for something private versus partner versus public? Robert, why don't you start?
I'll go ahead and start this one off. The big difference is if I'm building an API between two teams and it's going to be a point-to-point integration, there's going to be less design in the contract. Would we want it to be reusable? Yes, but quick to market, quick fixes, a lot of those things come into play. However, when you're building an API for the external to consume or even a partner, it needs to have all the effort that you put into putting a bottle of Tide on the shelf or building a product. You need to put all the design into it. It's usability, purpose, and constraints. And it really honestly takes a different skill set than just I can code an API to I can design an API. Because those usability and playing through with stakeholders and doing the trial and error with them really matters when it comes to public and partner APIs versus internal. Internal, you have a very controlled audience. They have to use it. Externally, they don't have to use it. They can go to your competitor.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, which one of the primary reasons why our public API kind of abstracts that away. We have a team who's more specialized in making it look nice for the outside world. So it is different than someone who is just throwing up an API because they're delivering some functionality in our app and in our product. But to touch on a point earlier, what is the same is our security. So even though it's like on a separate gateway, it's a separate concern, it is on the same exact security platform. You're authenticating the same way, just from a different place. And when you pass that through, we're just adding some additional checks, even at that front door. So you don't just have the privilege to get back to the back end, you also have to have privilege to get through the very front end. So a lot of differences in how we approach it, but the fundamentals are the same.
Excellent. Okay,
Yeah.
let's move on. Oh, sorry.
That one real quick. Because you both said something very interesting and intriguing. First of all, the fact that you have that abstraction layer, because at Kroger we have something extremely similar. We've called them shims traditionally, which I think John might have coined that term. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's just that abstraction layer, and as well with the public APIs, like I think it just kind of comes down to how you want to treat them, because we've got that shim layer, and the contract for that has not changed in 4 years. There's someone out here that can probably tell you all about it because they spent 4 years keeping it that way, right? But behind the scenes, the contracts for the upstreams for these APIs change constantly, right? And in some cases, they might even go away, and now we need to find a new service. Again, trying to maintain that public contract. So there was actually a ton of work going into those that whole time. But just looking at them from the public perspective, you would have never seen any difference, right? You would have said, oh, they haven't touched these APIs since they deployed them. Whereas with internal APIs, it's acceptable to iterate quickly, right? Because that's kind of the name of the game. So, and again, with like microservices, you can have smaller capabilities. So again, you're going to keep it really simple. You're going to get a second use case. You might add to it. So, just iterating as quickly as possible. Whereas with public APIs, I think iterating is kind of undesired, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, just to hammer that point home, same here. If you look at our public APIs, they all are V1. I promise you they're not all V1 in real life behind the scenes. So yeah, the goal is to not change, not disrupt your outside world.
We used to joke the #1 rule for versioning: don't do it. Make it backwardly compatible. That's not always possible, but when it is, it's worth it. Okay, so let's move on. We've talked a lot about a developer portal and what it is and some of the challenges and different ways you can go about it from a security perspective, but how do you tell what metrics, what key metrics do you use to tell whether your developer portal is successful or not? Let's start with Kinsey.
Well, I mean, some of the key metrics we've used is how often is it being called? I checked today, and I think in the past 30 days, we've had nearly 60 million calls coming to it. I think that's one metric. I'd like to see adoption, but I'd also like to see it evolve, and counterintuitively, I want to see the number of calls go down, meaning that we see a lot of chatter, and every time that happens, I think it's processing, it's another security handshake. I want to see actually people be able to do things more in bulk where possible. But I think usage and adoption means that you're providing value, uptime, all of the things that I think you look at when you're in any typical product.
Yeah. And I think one of the metrics that you get out of building a custom API marketplace or portal is you can see the growth, right? You start off with one client, then you can see when a second client gets that same level of access, the third client, and it's not always about the number of APIs you have. That's a terrible metric, let's just be real. Don't go by number of APIs, it's a falsehood. But if you go by how many clients you have adopting those APIs, you can actually run that in through with finance and everyone else and start showing even internally, here's your cost avoidance, here's your cost savings, let alone here's your free revenue from charging people per request call, right? So the more people you have using and consuming those APIs, the better, and seeing that growth, month over month, year over year, is one of the better metrics to follow on that, because one good quality, high, reusable API is far better than 1,000 ones that no one uses.
I'm gonna take us in a slightly different direction there to say that, like with metrics, it's the one thing I try to focus on is don't focus on any one metric at any time, right? So like, there's definitely a lot of recommendations on focusing on like growth of traffic for your gateway, right? Like, oh, the traffic's growing, that's great, right? But I always try to counterbalance that to think about the developer experience. So then look at that and say like, well, what's the onboarding time for the gateway? So, oh, our traffic continues to grow, but our onboarding time is a quarter, right? Like, that's terrible, right? Teams are spending a whole quarter just trying to expose their service for whatever it is they're working on. So I always try to, I call them balancing, right? But it's always like, hey, there's this metric, I'm very concerned that focusing on that metric is actually gonna drive the wrong behavior. Try to think what is the right behavior and measure those together. Is typically how I go about it. And where I'm gonna take this in a different direction is to say that it's actually extremely hard to measure a lot of these things. So I can tell you what the ideal metrics are that I want to be measuring. But in some cases you'll find that, like time to first call is a very common metric that's used. It is an extremely hard metric to gather, and it's an extremely hard metric to gather with accuracy as well. So, it's a constant struggle for us to continue to try to unlock new metrics regularly.
And James, you mentioned time to first call. You're talking about when someone first discovers an API to their ability to actually call for real. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, and that's what kind of creates, it's hard because it depends on how you and all of these can be classified differently, but you could say time to first call, which would be, in my opinion, from when you register an application until you make your first API call, right? A lot of people say time to integration, right? So that's from when you found the API to when it was actually live in production with your application. And then there's also the kind of discovery time. So like from when I found the API, and then how long until I made the first call, which is really more meaningful because they can spend a ton of time assessing the API because there was a lot of gaps in the developer portal that you didn't realize, and that might have been where they spent the bulk of their time, and then they might have got their credentials and made their first API call in a minute, right? So I don't know. Time to first call is a tough one for me because there's so many different ways you can look at it and so many different ways you can measure it.
Yeah. And to add on to the time to first call bandwagon, it's our priorities change all the time as developers. So you could start looking at something and it looks great. You're gonna register an app and then get pulled away for 6 hours and then come back and make a call. So now does it look bad on the marketplace for having a 6-hour gap, or is it just you don't know what's going on there? So it's a really tough one. You can get loose metrics on, hey, the registration process was easy. Hey, using our portal was easy to try something out. Those things come with that, but it's not a silver bullet, as James said. It's not one metric. There's just some really bad metrics that are proliferated.
Yeah, if you don't mind just adding on to that, you reminded me like one of the things that I thought was a good metric was how closely are you following standards? So our API has an Open API 3 spec, we have OAuth, we deal with scopes. These are all standards that if you're in this world, they sound familiar. But I think where that falls apart is not everybody knows how to use those, and it becomes a challenge with usability. And so I think another metric that is important is like, what's the support requests that are coming from that? From a security perspective, I think that if it's not clear to people how to use it, you open the gates there for them to unintentionally expose data. So I would just say that as a watch out, that standards and following them like doesn't really save you, but I think it is a good framework.
Well, and the standards help for that consistency so that they, the APIs look, taste, smell the same, you like to say. And people kind of develop an intuitiveness to how they work and things. I think there's some value there. The quality of documentation. So we've talked about documentation being part of it. One of the things I felt like we stumbled into accidentally was we hired some technical writers to help us with the writing, and man, did that make a difference. I don't know about you guys, but your average developer is not the best at writing documentation. But can you guys maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, truthfully, when I was part of the Kroger team building up their API program and doing this, Jessica Johnson and James Nose were the technical writers on it. Without them being there from the start and getting the consistent voice, that it would have never taken off internally, because explaining OAuth2 sounds easy on paper. Good luck. It's not. It's a pain. Every conversation I've ever had where someone tries to explain OAuth2, it's like, well, there's all this nuance that you just kind of hand waved. So getting a consistent voice around all the nuances with it, with how to use it, how to implement, let alone build an API that knows how to protect with it, that really comes from talented writers that can supplement the developers who can talk about it. But we're not wordsmiths. Let's let people who are far better at that and get that consistent voice out there. I think technical writers are almost a must in any API program.
Yeah, I would agree with that, in that I think we're still on a journey. We've done a great job documenting like our API, the contracts, the how-to, but there's a lot of finesse. I often battle with our product partners who want more documentation, and I try to convince them you cannot give this to a team and just expect everybody to really do a good job. I do think you have to have a special personality to, write something so technical while also explaining to people who don't really know what they're doing yet.
Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree with any of that as a former technical writer. So, but one of the interesting things, and if anyone's ever, which most of you probably have, been in a position of leading through influence, which can be really tough, and specifically related to API documentation, that's what we're doing, right? So we're making recommendations to people. We're writing best practices for folks to say, hey, when you're creating your API documentation, think through these things, think through what your consumer is going to go through, and write your documentation that way. And when I was a technical writer, which I am not a technical person, but I did learn at least enough JavaScript to go start developing some apps in my spare time, and I used our own documentation. I used our own specifications, right? And I used those when I integrated the Kroger APIs into the application. And that was one of the most enlightening things. And I recommend that to folks all the time. I'm like, hey, if you're not sure if you have good documentation, go use your documentation, and you'll quickly figure out if you have good documentation or not. So yeah, definitely, it's really challenging, but you just have to get folks to care about, hey, is this useful to my consumers? Because I can't tell you how many OS docs I've seen that are literally just parameters, a title, and I've seen things that have like an enum value and there's no values in the spec. And I'm like, okay, I don't even know what I would put in here. And all of those things too, I would encourage people to think about is, I wouldn't say it's like the laziness, but I would say keep in mind that if you cut corners in your documentation, you're likely going to give that time back answering support calls, right? Explaining it to people later. So I would say just save yourself the time, really think through it and write it up front.
So Mackenzie, I'm going to do another follow-up. You mentioned, sometimes it's a little overwhelming for consumers or producers to understand authentication, authorization, OAuth, style guide and things like that. So obviously having solid documentation goes a long ways for that. But I have heard on numerous occasions our teams complain about how people just flat out don't read the documentation. So one of the other ways that the developer portal can accelerate time to market and those types of things is to develop tooling to support. Earlier we mentioned in Kroger we had a linter to help, validate the API contract against a style guide, right? And spit back errors and stuff like that. There's, coding modules that can do OAuth 2 flows for you in, whatever language, pick your language, and you can have those, on the shelf ready to give to application teams to use, and that will speed up, their need to understand all the nitty-gritty details, but just being able to onboard fast. Are there any other things like that that you guys would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, definitely no one reads documentation, and I think people get more excited the nicer your site looks. So, definitely spend time on that. For us, authorization or that flow has been the biggest challenge for everyone. So, we've done everything from here's a code sample, here's literally the step-by-step, here's how you do it in Postman. And if that still isn't good enough, we actually have a tool on our developer portal where you can enter in all the information, and right there, within our app, you can go through the flow and then just copy and paste values that you need at the end to put into your product. And so I think don't assume that one way is going to work for everyone. You have to do the multi-pronged approach.
We went through that at Kroger for sure, and that's something we've done. Like, we have videos, right? We've done different tutorials. We've done infographic type stuff, right? So we've tried all kinds of different things to try to reach the audience. And then, as John mentioned, we built the live linter, and that's really a teaching tool. A lot of people just look at it and say, "Oh, it's just going to validate," but the way that we created that was really to try to use it as a teaching aid to kind of walk people through, so they get those error messages, they can go read what the problem was, they can go edit that, find the line, edit that, and use that to teach folks. And then one thing too with documentation is it's always staying ahead of the latest trends. So thinking about AI, which is something that we've been, generative AI, which is something Jessica Johnson over here, shout out, has been working very hard on helping us look at Kroger. And it's really around that same concept of like, people don't read, right? And now with something like generative AI, which is, trending up, instead of saying, hey, I'm gonna go to Google and I'm gonna say, how do I do this thing? And then I'm gonna find an article, and then I'm gonna skim through that article until I find out how to do this thing, right? Well, now you have the option of just going and asking, generative AI, how do I do this thing, right? And having a conversation and getting a direct answer. So, at this point, I think in the past we've been reactionary. Now we're actually trying to get ahead of it, right? And, meet folks where they are, so.
So let's, okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. Can you guys tell us about anything that you thought was a great idea for developer portal, or, that didn't pan out?
I think I think a lot of the decisions you learn from quickly. I mean, building an RBAC system that was not just traditional roles and groups and doing it in a different style. I learned a lot doing that when I was part of the Kroger team and did it there. But taking that knowledge, though, going into building yet another API marketplace, it taught me everything I needed to know to really make a more robust and more secure system. So it ebbs and flows. I mean, spinning up, teaching people Open API to saying that you should only use Open API, and then people generating code and say, well, you should design it by hand first. Those are all battles you're going to lose, and you're going to ebb and flow on them. It really depends on, can you make the point stick out to them of saying, this is what we need, because if you can't write good documentation, going to that aspect, if you're not willing to read the documentation and you're not writing good documentation, you have no right to complain, right? And I think when we push people through our marketplaces and try to get the producers to write excellent documentation, we fall flat. It doesn't work well. We get a lot of pushback. It's too much time consuming. If we go and try to do the reverse side, where we get people to our marketplace to read our documentation, you're also going to fail there, because some people like it, but it's honestly ebbs and flows. There's all kinds of trial and error that we don't know what's going to work, because if it was a solved problem, everyone would have it.
Excellent. Okay, I got one more for you before we open it up to the floor for Q&A. So if you guys have any questions that have been burning, you'll have a chance here in a second. Each one of you, tell us what's next, or what you see is big on the horizon for your developer portal / marketplace. James, you want to start?
Yeah, because I'm actually very excited about what's next for us, as I was just telling some folks before this. So we're kind of at a situation, and I'm sure others have either been there or in the journey of getting there, where we've been building out a lot of foundational things across all of our different platform teams. John has been doing a lot of great work over the years, building out the foundation of our gateway, and we're actually getting to a point where we can start to capitalize on that. These building blocks we've essentially laid out are starting to come together. So as an example, we're doing self-serve access for internal folks. So you'll be able to go and just request access to the API, the owner can approve it, you can instantly get access, things like that. Which
Seems so simple.
Yeah, right? So simple. But things that we've literally been dreaming about for years, and now we're at a point where every quarter we're able to deliver on those promises that we made, what feels like 6 years ago, right? So I would say really, for us, it's really just about capitalizing on the last 6 years of building that foundation at this point. To me, that's the most exciting part.
Yeah, for Paycor, I think that as we've expanded what's available on our public API, the next part of that journey is try and make it even easier. There's a lot of folks who know a lot or less technical who still need data, and so I think that is probably expanding our footprint into the various connectors of the world. If you've heard of Workato, Zapier, kind of the low no-code solutions, those probably have a direction where they lean into generative AI, where you could say, I just want to create a connection from A to B, and I want to translate, this data. I think you having the foundation of a public API or developer portal kind of sets you up for that, and so thinking ahead for what people are probably going to demand in the future.
Mine's probably the easiest. We're looking to launch. We just started our journey recently. We're looking to launch our portal internally and to partners, and then go on the journey to create public APIs. I mean, it's still in our roadmap, but definitely launching is what's big next for us.
All right, well, thanks, I appreciate it. I'd like to turn it over to the crowd. I'm gonna walk around and have you talk into this thing, and I've been told at least 4 times during this that I'm not talking loud enough, but who's got the first question first?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. One question I had, going back to how you make it, provide different API access to different consumers, whether it's internal or private partners or external. How do you differentiate which features are available to which consumers of the API, especially I'm thinking of public-facing ones, like you show them all this internal, features and capabilities that might confuse them, even if you put on there, hey, this is only available to our internal folks.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab, and then Mackenzie has a comment too. So, honestly, we're creating. I'll repeat the question back. Okay, cool. So the question was around how do we make sure that the public, partner, and private don't see all the features, and necessarily when an API is only for the private side, the associate side, how do we make sure that the public doesn't see it and get confused? The big way the way that we're going to tackle it is through authorization, and honestly, we're going to allow people to create 3 different contexts of the documentation. It may come from one source, and using things in the markdown or using things in the code, allow them to segment or authorize off certain sections, but a lot of it's really going to come down to is you have different personas. You may document one API with 400 attributes, the partner only gets 200 of those attributes, and the public only gets 10. You have to write 3 specs unless you have a creative system that can trim it off. But realistically, you may have 3 bits of documentation.
Yeah, and I would say, for us, because we already segment public versus private, that's helpful in that regard. But just because you can go to our developer portal and see a list of 50 plus APIs, there are actually more APIs that maybe we have to go and develop something specific for a partner. We still control all the access to that in our developer portal, so we have a concept of what we call expansion packs. So we'll add this to your OAuth client, and only you can see and access it because it was purpose built. So we try and still keep everything consolidated. I think not reinventing the wheel for those that need to be a little bit more private, but still public is what we aim for.
Oh, after that, ours is probably a pretty simple solution for a lot of things. Is that for our internal users, we have a flag on their profile. And so for general things, right, it's just kind of based off of that. But then we also have role-based access that we built, and that's built on top of what we call organizations and teams, which you can go to our developer marketplace, you can create an organization. Within that, you can create additional teams. So then we can scope access to an API to an individual user with an application. We can then scope that to teams within an organization or to a broader organization. So it kind of gives us multiple levels to scope that documentation. And then within that, we also have different roles that can be assigned to those. I think we have 4 or 5 different roles at this point, one that maybe we're going to use. But yeah, those can further, take that down and find it.
Any other questions? I've got one. All right. We're gonna hand it.
Thank you, John. So, can you guys hear back there? Okay, I'm gonna nerd out for a second. Robert and I spent some time 7 or 8 years ago, the brainchild of what became Dev Portal Kroger, and we prioritized connective tissue from OAuth to the type of information a developer would need to consume, right? So my question for the panel is, what is the evolution now when we think of analytics and monitoring? Because we talked about what is relevant data for a user of a portal. Like, what would you want a user to be focusing on and not? So my question is, what is the current state of maybe a data visualization layer for the aggregate set of users, both internal and external? So it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity there to pursue that layer, or does it already exist? Or is that something that is desired and maybe that's the next evolution? So the question basically was around data viz, and what is the maturity of that currently? Because that could really inform a lot of accurate or more desired tracking of these metrics.
Yeah, so taking the analytics approach for the developer marketplace or portal in general is, I know for us, we're just starting that journey, but our plan is, because we are using the same UI, the same system, we don't have it segmented, it's all in one, all based on authorizations, we get all the analytics in one place. Now, we are gonna tie that to our multiple different API gateways, different technology stacks, pull in all those analytics to then start deducing, hey, these are internal to internal calls, these are internal to external, external to internal. I think having those is really just focusing, as I refer back to a lot of the data science folks I talk to nowadays, is you can have all the data in the world. If you don't take the time to clean it up, you have nothing, right? So we're gonna have to sit there and trudge through and clean up that data first. But I do think you're right. Eventually we're gonna get to a point that you wanna have that visualization that really just shows you all the connective tissue, right?
Yeah, and I think that definitely step one is having the API gateways. Like, you need to have traffic flowing through the same mechanisms. And so for us, any sort of monitoring and visualization is kind of clued into your gateway. And so, a lot of the big tools out there, Microsoft's App Insights, New Relic, App Dynamics, are all able to plug into that. And so I think from a monitoring, trending perspective, that's where we would plug into. We also have additional things that, any requests and response coming in, we are also trying to capture that outside of monitoring, not only for additional statistics, but then to ease some of our support, because you do want to know when there are issues, what are they quickly, and also usability and how popular is something.
Yeah, maybe the final thing I'd say on that, because I think you all summarized it well. And Robert, you used to ask me this all the time, right? But then you really need to ask, what are the questions that you want answered to, right? Because one thing I hear is it's kind of like this: give me all the analytics, give me all the metrics, I want to see it all, right? But what actually matters? What are you going to actually use, right? And so that's really where we try to focus. We want to be able to show some basic metrics to consumers when they're browsing the catalog, right? So we ask folks, we say, hey, when you're assessing whether to use this API or that API, if they both have, what would work for you, right? What are those questions you want to know, right? They say, oh, I want to see uptime for the services, right? Because if I could use either, and one's got a 50% uptime, the other one's 99, right? Easy decision, right?
You guys, you can also drive good repetitive patterns and actions too through. I'm using coach voice. But, you really could by just kind of tapping into that. So,
yeah.
thank you.
one of the things I found interesting was, you know, our API platform evolved over time. It started off just in a data center, one gateway, you know, which quickly turned into, well, it's on-prem and in the cloud, and then it turned into it's on-prem and in the cloud in two different clouds, you know, and then it turned into, well, where, you know, you've got all of this coming in some type of central entry point. For us, it's Akamai, and, you know, you got to get all of those metrics, you know, to have that global picture, and that's been a challenge for us to get all of those metrics in. You know, maybe everybody doesn't need all of them, so it's easy to solve for the person that's just looking for a specific API metrics. But what about the calls that never made it to their upstream? You know, we don't even have those metrics in Kong. You'd have to go up to Akamai to get it and figure out why it failed there, right? And then how do you pull all those metrics in holistically to look across the board on everything? So we're in the middle of trying to solve that. It's an interesting problem.
And how do you make them usable?
Make them usable.
This is a whole
I
nother
think there
thing.
might have been another question over here.
So, this is an API Security Meetup. We're talking about developing API portals and marketplaces, and I understand how that all ties in. A classic kind of security issue is the easier you make it for somebody to do something, usually the less secure it gets. There's got to be that balance, right? And so, along with all the stuff, reducing friction and getting developers onboarded quicker and making that time to first call faster, there's probably some concessions being made there, or possibly some concessions being made there to allow that to happen. What are some risks that maybe you've seen in the portals you've got, and how did you mitigate those? And so, like one example I know that we've seen is people who don't understand OAuth, don't read manual, they'll go and they'll put their credentials out in their GitHub repository. So they've created an API client, they can get to APIs, and now they've got their credentials back in. So we have to monitor for those, we reset those. So we've made it really easy for people to register, but now we've also made it easy for them to kind of unintentionally break the rules. So what kind of other things do you see like that? How do you mitigate those?
Yeah, the secrets one is the big one. I mean, even internal developers who are either junior or haven't done it in a while accidentally commit a file and it has a secret in there, right? It goes up to GitHub, it's out there. The best way for some of those tactics is honestly it's your risk assessment and your tooling and info security, right? Doing Git leaks to where you're constantly scanning GitHub for anything related to your software and the secrets. Having your monitoring with your security event managers to where, yeah, traffic's going through your gateways are doing a risk assessment, they're analyzing the tokens, they're making sure, you know, the call going to the service is legitimate, it's within the rate limits, but send that off to a system like No Name Solve Traceable, who does API threat analytics, and then start making some decisions there. I think the onboarding part, making it really easy to onboard, doesn't lower your security if your security is already risk-based and already a solid foundation. I mean, what's the harm in someone getting access to 1,000 API calls for a public API? You have 1,000 calls you have to process, right? You're already having the same footprint for the people with 10,000 calls a second. It's just you're now analyzing them differently and you cut them off. So defense in depth is really the key, and using it as a multi-prong check a litany of things. And you know, to that point, I always recommend that API gateways are blunt tools. You have to have the experts that know how to hone the blade to cut down the tree. If you don't have the experts, don't use the tool.
Yeah, and for us, there's definitely a need to make it easy, right? If you're a developer for a company and you use Paycor for your payroll, the developer needs to be able to go in and they see a lot of stuff, they can set it up. But at the end of the day, we have the luxury of already having accounts, and we know the roles that those users have in our system. So a developer can go set up and create an OAuth account, and they can request privileges, but they can't be the ones that actually turn on the access. So we are mandating that you're someone at your organization that has a higher level of access to actually do that. And we always start from least privilege. So you come in, you're at no access. Anything that you turn on and toggle and say, I want to view SSNs, well, that HR administrator or that person higher up in your company is going to have to acknowledge wait, you created something that needs to see socials, like we were not doing that. So we do try and add, make the developer experience easy while protecting the data that we know needs protected.
I see what you did there. I'm not telling you all of our secrets, so, although you already know all of our secrets. Yeah, your secrets actually. But also it's just acceptable risk too, right? Like one of the things with our public APIs, right, was like, hey, we don't want people building out catalogs of our product data, so we're gonna rate limit it to 10,000 per day, per application, and there's no limit on how many applications a user can have, right? So, really like that's a security concern. We don't want people building out a product catalog, right? Like they can just scale up their applications quickly and keep calling it until they hit the 10,000, move on to the next application, right? So, things like that you don't, hindsight, right? You don't completely think through it. But it's really just understanding, is that a problem, right? Like, is that really a problem? And then starting to come up with a mitigation strategy from there. Because I think a lot of things we would consider fair, like in that case, it's acceptable if we were to see anomalies, like if we were to see, accounts with 50 or 60 applications like we have, right? That's usually a trigger to look into it, but yeah.
Yeah, one more thing to add, you just triggered a thought, is there's a lot about the usability, but then from a pure technology perspective, using OAuth can actually help you here too. If you're scoping that access, it limits the blast radius. So if something were to get compromised with a refresh token, or they put their credentials in GitHub, hopefully that's the ownership that they're taking, their risk, but if somebody uses it, it doesn't compromise the entire company. It compromises that particular piece of data that they were given access to. So I just want to highlight that too.
Contracts. One of the things that has been called out, if you come to a couple of these API security meetups, as a good security thing that developer portals play directly into is your API catalog. It's hard to secure stuff you don't know about. Get your APIs in a catalog. If you don't even, I know there's some at Kroger that don't go through our gate, that are exposed to external, so it's still an effort to get everything cataloged and know about it. Products like No Name and Salt, you can put behind reverse proxies and Akamai and other things to find those rogue APIs. So again, just the fact that you have a developer catalog is, contributing to your security in some ways. Any other questions?
So, okay, thanks. This one was kind of touched on previously, but have you experimented, or how much have you experimented, or which ways with connecting your API documentation with LLMs or generative AI, like connecting it up, like using, let's say, like LangChain, which is a new tool, or OpenAI's API to allow, I guess, let's say me as a consumer of the API hypothetically to kind of use natural language queries against the documentation?
So we haven't hooked up to an LLM for sure, but I think a lot of the emphasis on having that experience in the developer marketplace is allowing people to find the APIs based on their contextual knowledge, right? For instance, if you're trying to build an API that's looking for a customer data, well, one API may call it customer, another API may call it user, another API calls it this, but if you're actually able to index that data, even going back to like really performant search engines, you can contextualize that data and find it a lot easier. I think LLMs and feeding it into that generative bit will give the back and forth for a consumer to make it easy to interact with, but I think still it comes back to clean data, descriptive data, and really getting to just indexing the heck out of it.
Yeah, and just to answer your question directly, we haven't done that, but some of our competitors have, and I think that some of those things, there's so many like standard use cases that people are using their APIs for that I'm not sure how much value yet, like throwing an LLM against your documentation would be. I do think that giving folks the ability to create an SDK, so that's the value of like Open API. Is probably more powerful right now, but I do see where folks are going to expect that experience as time goes on. So I foresee us doing that, but we haven't done it yet.
I'm going to say the same. We have not yet, but I would be lying if I said we haven't already started thinking about that. And definitely, there's been some discussions about what that might look like, but not yet. Yeah.
Anyone else? I see some tired faces. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, that concludes our API Security Meetup. I would be remiss if I did not give out a huge thanks and shout out to Paycor for hosting us here today. I also have to shout out to Phil from Engage. He is doing the heavy lifting on all of our setup and audio and everything else. And none of this would be happening if Leslie Peterson wasn't at the helm, organizing and keeping us on target. One other thing, and Engage in general, they started this with us and have hosted several. We're trying to move it around just to get more participation from different areas. So which kind of leads me to my next pitch. If if you're passionate in this space and then you've got some expertise and want to share it, talk to us. We're always looking to line people up to give these presentations and share knowledge. Did I forget anything? Yes.
Online people do this, but one thing we do to get back to the community is host a lot of meetups, and one is coming up. Community meetup. Charlie, you want to?
Sure. Engage hosts a meetup each third Wednesday of every month. It's called Code Craft and Community. We get together, we usually pair up and write some code. Next one is next Wednesday, and we'll be doing some exercises from the Sans Holiday Hack Challenge that just happened. So come and have some fun breaking into things. It's a game. It's fun. Looking forward to seeing you.
Any other meetups?
Michael, you got anything you want to plug?
We're already getting started on the planning for Momentum, so if anybody's interested in that, check it out on devcon.com, look for sponsors, and if you're specifically interested in getting involved and helping to organize, we are growing the team, so reach out and we can talk.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it.
Next month's
What time?
Next month's.
Next month's topic. Okay, good call. So next month, we're gonna try to tease apart the difference between authentication and authorization. They're not the same, and it's been an interesting topic. We've had to tackle this.
Who's speaking?
And we have David Greenwald. I don't know if you know him. He works at Kroger, and Michael's brother Keith. I just blanked on his name for a second. Keith Richardson, and they are both deep in authentication and authorization space, and should be very interesting to hear their talk next month. So look for that. We'll update it on the API Security Meetup once we have those two. I think we're really done this time. All right.
Thank you, panel.